Hello. Okay, so we're this is sort of our final chapter in ethics, so to say, right now. We've done the first 5 chapters of Shmona Prakim. Started with the full analysis of the soul, human soul, that which produces all of human actions. We narrowed our attention, our discussion down to one, the appetitive faculty. And then we gave in chapters 3 and 4 a complete linear development of the human personality and how it starts from being sort of at a low level and requiring instruction from others, progressing until we get to the point that a person has to evaluate oneself. Okay. 5th chapter then said what the purpose of all of this was. And the purpose of all of this, excuse me, the purpose of all of this was to enable a person to climb the ladder, ascend the ladder of the great intellectual apprehension of God, Yidiyat Hashem. Okay. And we emphasized a number of things. Number one, the key method that receives its most expansive treatment is the middle of the road, and the middle is never defined. Middle is never defined. One basic point there, we had 2 approaches to this lack of definition of the middle. First is that Shmona Prakim is an introduction to Maseches Avos. Maseches Avos will present the sayings of all the rabbis. It presents the saying of all the rabbis, all the details. In the introduction, we're just giving the background, the theoretical background. So it turns out that without saying so explicitly, the sayings of the rabbis constitute the middle. That's the particularities of the middle. If I recall correctly, from what I've read in the Nicomachean Ethics, discusses individual cases of character traits and dispositions and tries to establish a middle. But the Rambam doesn't need it because he has Maseches Avos. Then we said there was a deeper level to that even after we have the middle and preventative, corrective measures to tilt, we still don't require any discussion because the Rambam points out that the laws of the Torah take care of that automatically. If you live by the laws of the Torah, you almost automatically cover all of these behavioral character traits will be developed in a human being. So we never had to deal with that. The second thing we pointed out in the difference with Aristotle is that the Rambam is of the opinion that without fully developed character, the intellectual ascent is impossible. It was impossible. Whereas in Aristotle, if you in comparison to the Rambam, Aristotle is thinking of the two as relatively independent. A person whose head is always buried in sensuality all the time, okay, and does sensuality and is given to anger and is impatient and all of that, is not cut out for the intellectual life. That's a simple fact. But it is quite possible for a person not to really excel in character and nonetheless be intellectually accomplished in the higher studies. Okay, it's a major distinction. The Rambam's view, as I understand it, is that a person's personality and passions influence perception of reality. They influence, certainly, it's obvious day to day, they influence practical perceptions of practical reality, of how to behave and how to evaluate and everything. But the Rambam is of the opinion that one requires ruling of one's passions to master the intellectual understanding of reality. Okay, that sets a Rambam apart from Aristotle. Okay, so now in Hilchos Deos, we're going to go back to the other material. In Hilchos Deos, the Rambam opened his code of law, Mishnah Torah, with Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the basic foundational beliefs that are necessary for the whole life of Torah to function. And the next section is Hilchos Deos, character traits. So he's coming back to this discussion. Now, the Rambam gave a tremendous sense of chiddush in including Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah as part of the halacha, as part of the law. Namely, the Rambam was really in that sense groundbreaking in turning beliefs into obligations, okay, into halachic obligations. But Hilchos Deos automatically is in the law. After all, Maseches Avos is part of the Mishnah. It's part of the most basic text we have of the oral law. Furthermore, everybody always understands, why does Maseches Avos start with Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai? It starts with Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai for the precise purpose of telling you that what the rabbis are saying is not general wisdom, but is equally part of Torah, part of the halacha. Okay, so it's natural that Hilchos Deos is here, and yet as we'll see in this context within the law, the Rambam's treatment of these issues of character traits are quite different from what we thought in the beginning of Shemona Prakim. So as the old saying goes, let's go to the share screen. Here we are. Okay. So the Rambam, as usual, in the beginning lists the mitzvos, and the mitzvah that is most important for us is the first one, lehidamos bidrachav, that our behavior will ultimately be imitation of the ways of God. Okay, there's a famous Latin phrase that everybody uses, imitatio Dei, literally the hidamos bidrachav. Okay, so let's go straight to the Rambam's giving of the presentation. Okay, Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph. He's opening up. Deos harbe yesh l'chol echad ve'echad mibnei adam, v'zo misheno mizo, u'rechoko mimenu b'yoser. There are many different dispositions that exist for every single person, and each is different from the other and far away from it. I'm not too sure about, the Rambam keeps using these phrases. I think here it means people are really genuinely, completely different, okay? And he will give examples. And we've seen them all in the Shemona Prakim. Yesh adam shehu ba'al chema koes tamid. V'yesh adam sheda'ato miyusheves alav ve'eno koes klal. We have a person who's always ready, who's always at edge and always indulges in anger. And another person who is so settled, it sounds like he's almost insensitive. V'im yechas, but when he does get angry, yechas kaas ma'at b'chama shonim. He will be angry once in many years. V'yesh adam shehu gval leiv b'yoser. There is a person who is arrogant. V'yesh adam shehu shefal ruach b'yoser. And then there is a person who is excessively self-effacing. And then he gives all the examples that we have seen and discussed in the Shemona Prakim. In this, all other character traits, all other dispositions in the personality could go maholel be'onein, namely the party animal versus the person who seems to be, who's so dour, he's in personal mourning almost. V'chilai v'shoa. Okay, what is v'chilai v'shoa? V'chilai v'shoa is a phrase from Yeshaya, okay, in chapter 32. It's an interesting point. Everything that the Rambam wrote except for Mishnah Torah, is in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic. And so everything we see is through translations from basically the Ibn Tibbon school, if not from him, from others. And so therefore, we think the Rambam's personal sense of idiom, it's only known in Arabic. And what we know in Hebrew are the translators. Turns out when you read him in Arabic, in Hebrew, you see that he had quite a different sense of idiom. So what's V'chilai B'Shoah? Okay, that chapter is chapter 32 in Yeshaya, where Yeshaya is speaking about the just king. And in the days of the just king, it says, let me find it. Lo yikore od linavol nadiv. We will not call a miser a generous man, and we will. And that day, truth will be so complete. The sense of justice will be so complete. We don't have to flatter people anymore. Ulichilai lo ye'omer shoah. All right. V'chilai, I'm reading Radak now. Shenosem b'midah. He only gives exactly as necessary. V'lo yoser davar b'shum panim. He will not spend an extra penny. Ve'eno tzara. He has a miserly instinct. Avalei pachos. It's not even that he's a lowlife. The naval is a low. Before we had naval and nadiv. He's a lowlife, and nadiv is noble. But now we're speaking about a person who spends, but he's not a lowlife. B'shoah hu vatram b'mamono ma'od. Sameach b'matnosov. It's a person who's easy with his money, and he's happy to give it away. The way Radak explains that this person is even at a higher level than a nadiv. A nadiv is noble and always does the right thing, etc. But this shoah is a person who is really extremely generous. So this is the phrasing in the Rambam here, v'chilai v'shoah. V'achzari v'rachaman, everybody knows that, someone who is vicious and merciful. V'rach levo v'amitz koach, a person who is a coward and almost a heroic courage. V'chayotze b'hem. And the Rambam continues, V'yesh ben chol dayo v'dayo harachokom mimeno. Within every character traits, from one extreme to another, because excuse me, V'yesh ben kol dayo v'dayo harachokom mimeno b'kotzeho acher, dayos benonios. There's always a middle approach. Zo rachokom mizo. I'm not sure about the syntax here, but it seems to clearly mean that it's equidistant from the two extremes. V'chol hadayos, yesh mehen dayos shehen la'adam mitchilas briyaso lefi teva gufo. In every single character trait, there are some that a person is simply born with. V'yesh mehen dayos shetiv'o shel adam mechuvan v'osid lekabel osam b'mehera yoser misha'ar hadayos. And then there are certain character traits that even though a person doesn't come out of the womb with them, he's clearly predisposed to ultimately go there, okay? To ultimately acquire them later with hardly any effort. There are some that a person really doesn't tend to in these character traits. But he learned them. He learned them from others. Ocean if nelehem, or he turned to them me'atzmo, by himself. Lefi machshavo shel sabelibo. Namely, a person in introspection thought that he or she ought to cultivate a particular character trait, and possibly at the extreme, possibly. Osha shama, or he may have heard shazo hadiyot tovalo. A person may have heard that one particular character trait will be beneficial. Or he heard that a particular character trait was very beneficial, and therefore he adopted it. So now the Rambam says, in all of this whole world of possibilities of human behavior, shtei tzavot harachakot zo mizo, shebachol dayo v'dayo, and every choice in the human disposition, the two extremes, enon derech tovo, they're not the right way. Ve'ein ro'ui lo li'adam loleches bahem v'lo lolamdam be'atzmo. A person should not follow them nor teach them to himself. If he sees he's sliding to one of these particular extremes, either way, or even if he's not on that road, but he sees a propensity in his character, or he sees that he picked it up, he will bring himself back to the middle, will go the good way, and that is the straight road. Haderech hayeshara himidah beinonis. It is the middle of the character trait. Shebachol deyo v'deyo mikol hadeyo sheyesh lo li'adam. And every single character trait up for grabs in human existence, the one in the middle, that's the derech hayeshara, the straight road. V'hi hadeyo shehi rechoka mishtei haktzavos richuk shaveh. It's smack in the middle. Ve'ina kravo lo lazo v'lo lazo. It doesn't tilt to one or the other. L'fichach tzivu hachachamim harishonim. The first wise man said, have instructed us. Wise men have instructed us. Shehei adam sham deyosav tamid. Sham means to evaluate. Umesha'erosam, and estimate where they are. Umechavenosam b'derech lamtzuis, and point them and direct them to the middle road. Kidei shehei shalem begufo. That's how a person's physical being, okay, becomes perfect. Shalem. Ketzad, how? Lo yehei ba'al chema noach l'chos. He should not be easy to become angry. V'lo kames, he shouldn't be like a dead person. Namely, he's so indifferent and uncaring. V'lo kames, no margish. Rather, elo benoni. He should be rather in the middle. What does that mean? Lo yichos elo al davar gadol shero'ui lechos elo. K'dei shelo ye'asek hayotze bo pam acheres. He should only get angry on something, something flagrant that is worthy of being angry about, for the purpose that it never happen again. There's no getting angry for personal release of frustration. Only functional, to prevent it from happening again. V'chein, etc. And he gives his examples of the middle. And then he says, "V'lo yehei maholel v'sochek." He should not be what we call today a party animal. V'lo etzev otzev yonem, nor a downer, so to say. Elo someach kol yomav benachas b'seva ponim yafos. But rather of a happy disposition. I think that means inwardly. Benachas, calmly. B'sever panim yafos, namely so that his interactions with other people will be of a very generous and gracious style, okay? So apparently the only way to truly carry off sefer panim yafos is that inwardly there's a quiet simcha within one's personality. V'chein she'ar deyosov, that applies to everybody else, to all other character traits. V'derech zohi derech hachachamim. This is the way of the wise people. Kol adam shedeyosav deyos beinonios b'mutzaos nikro chacham. He's a genuinely wise man because such a person is a master. Knows the human being, knows himself, and has mastered it. Has mastered himself. There's a little more, though. A person who is more fastidious, V'yisrachek midea beinonis ma'at letzad zeh o letzad zeh nikra chasid. The statement is a little strange, but he's going to immediately explain it. Anybody who tilts slightly to one side, or this side or that side, is called a chassid. Now, it doesn't mean that if you tilt slightly to either side in any character trait. He's going to explain it right now, okay? Ketzad, how is that? He gives an example, what makes it clear. Mishi yisrachek migova halev ad katseho acharon v'yesh fal ruach b'yoser nikro chassid v'zo midas hachasidus. A person who goes to the far other extreme, he is called a chassid. Something's missing here, right? We had this already in Shmona Prakim, where in the theoretical world, the general world of piety, even non-Jewish piety, Chassidut meant tilting a little preventative, corrective behavior was always slightly from the middle. The example, the Rambam, and then it turned out in Shmona Prakim, when the Rambam says the Torah takes care of all preventative measures, he really describes the Torah as pushing us almost, but not at, the far extreme to the opposite. And here, he actually gives the far extreme to the opposite. And he's going to say that in Shval Ruach, you have to go to the complete extreme to the other side later and talk about it. It's so strange that he gives this example right after he says, Ma'at letzad zeh o letzad zeh. Okay. V'im nisrachek ad ho'emtza belvav v'hiyeh arnav, nikra chacham, v'zo mihi midas ha'chachma, v'al derech zo sha'ar kol hadeyos. V'chasidim harishonim, our early pietists, hayu matin deyosein shalahem miderech ho'emtzois, keneged shtei haktzavos. The original Hasidim would always go away from the absolute middle towards the edges, towards the extremes. Yesh deyosha matinoso keneged hakatzeho acharon, namely towards deficiency. V'yesh deyom shematinoso keneged hakatzeho rishon. Sometimes they would go to excess. Okay, the zolifnim mishuras adim, and basically in sensuality, they move towards deficiency, and in acquisitive, namely monetary manners, they tend towards what? Not being emphasized on holding on to money. Umitzuvin anu loleches bedrochim hoelu habenonim, and we are commanded to go in these middle roads. V'hem hadrochim hatovim v'hayeshorim, shenemar v'halachta b'drachot. Now, what's the mitzvah? To be literally in the middle road? Or, so that already pushes aside the Chasidim Rishonim. But it's quite clear the Rambam wants to include Chasidim Rishonim in one's behavior. So I think Bidrachim Elu Habenonim, he's even referring to the Chasidut as part of the theory of Benoniyut, of the middle road. That's what, and namely, Drachim might not only refer to particular character traits, but the two approaches, the one of Chachma and the one of Chasidut. Okay. V'hem hadrachim hatovim v'hayeshurim shenamar v'halachta b'drachot. Kach limdu b'feirosh mitzvah zo. Mahu nikro chanon, afato hayei chanon. Mahu nikro rachum, afato hayei rachum. Mahu nikro kadosh, afato hayei kadosh. What does it mean to follow in God's path? So the Sifra says, the same way the God is called gracious, you also be gracious. The same way that he is referred to as merciful, you also be merciful. And the same way that he is referred to as holy, you also be holy. Ba'al derech zo, on this manner, karu hanavim lo'eh b'chol osam hakinuyim. In this way, all the prophets were rather casual in giving descriptions of God. In this manner, erech apayim v'rav chesed, tzaddik v'yashar, tomim, gibor, v'chazak, patient, great kindness, tzaddik v'yashar, all of these, all powerful. Lahodia shehem drachim tovim v'yasharim, v'chayav adam lahanhig atzmo behem, ulehidamos elov k'fi kocho. To teach us that these are the good and straight paths, and a person has to conduct himself in this path in order to what? To imitate, within one's ability, to imitate God. Okay, there's a bit to unpack over here. Okay, first of all, if you notice, there's a slide in this mahu afato. There's a slight change in what we're used to saying. We are used to quoting the Gemaras that say mahu rachum afato rachum, afato haye rachum, mahu chanun afato haye chanun. That's how we always mahu mavaker cholim afato mavaker cholim, right? Abraham Avinu, all right. Okay. However, the Rambam chose a formulation that is in the Sifra, Mahu Nikra. The Rambam, in his first chapter, says, it is crucial that God is incorporeal. And the Rambam says point blank, God has no emotions. Because to have emotions is to humanize God. And humanizing God has the reverse effect of deifying the human being. Okay? All right. So the point is that if you watch the way he's speaking, see, he's referred to as Rachum. He's referred to as Chanun. And the Nevi'im call him all these things. Why are we allowed to do this if they're not the absolute truth as a statement about God? And the answer is, Lahodia shehem drachim tovim yeshurim. The only way we can speak about God is to use humanistic terms. And the way we describe emotional adjectives has a purpose. Okay, has a purpose. That we will, if we describe God as being merciful, okay, then we will attempt to be merciful the way he is. And that's the mitzvah. Okay? So it's a all right. There's more than one problem here, and I'm going to go back to it in a minute or so. Okay, we'll finish the chapter, and then we'll discuss it in detail. How does a person perfect oneself with these character traits? The answer is, this is literally as we discussed in Shemona Prakim, Ya'aseh v'yashaneh v'yashalesh b'ma'asim she'oseh al pi hadeyos ha'emtzo'iyos v'yachzor b'hem tamid. A person must consistently force oneself to always do the middle road and keep repeating it, ad sheyihiyu ma'asehem kalim olav, till they become almost natural. It's no struggle to do what's in the middle road. Right, we said that was the main, this is the main underpinning of the whole theory, that the same way that the human personality produces behavior, consistent behavior, development of habit can actually produce change in the personality. And this is the way to do it. And now he concludes. These character traits that we have listed above, they are the ones that have been, that we ascribe to God. He's always referred to and described him. And they are the middle road that we are obligated to travel. Nikreis derech zo, derech Hashem. This path is the path of the Lord. V'hi shalimed Avraham Avinu Lavanov, Shene Amar, Ki yadativ, Laman asher yitzaves banoves beso acharov. I have singled him out in order that he command his children and his household after him. V'shamru derech Hashem, and they shall follow the way of the Lord. La'asot tzedakah mishpat, to do justice and to do righteousness and justice. Wow. So that's what's said about Abraham Avinu. So a person who does this, who behaves in the manner that we have just described along the middle road, that is the derech Hashem that is referred to in that pasuk, in that verse. The one who travels this road, brings goodness and blessing to himself. Shenema, the conclusion of the verse, that God will bring upon to Abraham everything that he had promised him. Okay. So now we have to deal with a number of difficulties. Some of them are really obvious. They stand out, they kind of knock you over the head. So let's go after them one by one. The first deal is there is no sense of process here. We had a process. We wanted to produce a person who was going to always do the right thing. We started at the beginning with analysis and just worked our way through, developed him along the way, gave a goal at the end. None of the process of development is indicated here, going from external wisdom to the self-regulated middle road, to the laws of the Torah being the guide for self-regulation, and then self-inspection on top of living by the laws of the Torah. None of that is hinted at here at all. That's number one. Number two, the goal is not here. In the Shmona Prakim, the goal was to create a person, the ethical development of a person, was to create a person who could then truly undertake the intellectual apprehension of God. Ascend that last ladder, okay, of human adventure. It's not here. You know where it shows up? It shows up down. I'll show you. It shows up down in chapter 3 here, Perigymel. The first part of Perigymel refers to the first section, Halacha Aleph, discusses against asceticism, something that we saw in detail back in the Shmona Prakim. And now comes Tzarich Adam sheyichavein libo v'chol ma'asav kulam leidas Hashem baruch hu bilvad. And then he speaks about ordinary material life. All pleasures of material life can be indulged in, but they are all to feed a person's well-being so that the intellectual effort can proceed without difficulty. That's it. So what it turns out to be is here, it is almost a foil. It is not thought of as a linear development to its peak of a process to its goal, but rather here it's basically a foil against asceticism. Changes its view from Shmona Prakim. That's the second thing. The third thing. The Rambam says as follows. How do we know? He says, "Umitzuvim anu lalechas b'drachim ho'elu habenonim, v'hem hadrachim hatovim v'hayesharim shenemar v'halachta b'drachav." And then he says, "Mahu nekvachanon," etc. How do we know that's the middle of the road? Correct. And how do we know that tzedakah, that the middle of the road is Avraham Avinu, the Derech Hashem? Okay, there one could say that the ultimate meaning of tzedakah mishpat is a sort of a balance of interests in human affairs and giving everyone their due. One could say that, and it shows up in the Morah, but one almost doesn't need the Morah. One could get away with that. And say that tzedakah mishpat is an expression of the middle road, maybe. However, up here, Beinonim is v'halachta b'drachav mahu racham afato racham mahu chana nafato. Where does that come from? I don't know any source. Anybody have read, whether traditional or modern scholarship? I haven't seen it. I have seen one thing, and that is from Marvin Fox, a Jewish philosopher from about a half generation ago to a generation ago. So he gives an interpretation in terms of the Moreh Nevuchim, and it fits what's going on here. Okay, he says as follows: there's a chapter in Moreh Nevuchim which describes God's creation as being perfectly balanced, perfectly calibrated. Anything that we cannot survive absolutely for a moment without, there's plenty of it. Oxygen, to say the least. Okay, and even beyond that, water, plenty of water. And he goes down through a list of things that the more necessary they are for human existence, the more abundant they are. And the less absolutely necessary, the less abundant they are. That's number one. So there's perfect balance in God's creation. Another chapter has a discussion how perfectly calibrated are the mitzvahs, God's revelation. The only two ways we know anything about God is by inspecting his creation and by knowledge of his revelation to us. If one looks at the world of the mitzvahs, they're never too hard. Namely, they don't take a human being over the edge that the human being, qua human being, can no longer exist in a normal functioning manner. And yet they provide everything for the full development of the human being. They make the human being better than he might be, or she might be. So there's this perfect balance in the behavior of the creation. So our knowledge of God is always, the way Professor Fox is looking at it, is always a knowledge of balance in one way or another, whether it's perfect calibration in the creation or in the laws of the Torah. In still another chapter, the Rambam says, okay, and he gives expression to these phraseology here. When we look at nature and the laws of the Torah, and we see how they care for the animal world, for the human being world, and the way they're calibrated is to make sure that existence continues and that it be full and that it be healthy. All of these things are possible. If we saw a human being doing all of that, we would say that that human being is merciful. If we would see the sense of restraint in a human being, we might start to say that human being is kadosh. And the same thing with Erech HaPayim and Rav Chesed. All these things that we see in nature, had we seen them in a human being, we would have used these human adjectives to describe what they are. That's the chiddush of Marvin Fox. And he says that's why here, halachta b'drachav, given the interpretation it is indeed the middle road, the perfectly calibrated personality. Or as I described it when we studied chapter 4, I said the unencumbered personality, namely one that does everything correctly in its proper place and its proper time. And he always does it treats the circumstance in front of him. Okay. Okay, there happens to be a very good explanation of the Rambam. However, you got to admit, the ordinary reader of the Mishnah Torah, how's he ever going to figure that out? The Mishnah Torah does not presuppose the Moreh, the other way around, I would think, anyway. You need the full Mishnah Torah and absorb the full law to lead the life of the law, And then you have both the spiritual and practical preparation from which to continue the ascent up to the highest heights of human existence. Okay. So how does all of this work? Okay. Those are the difficulties that sort of hit you right in the faces when you read it, especially if you have the Shmona Prakim in mind. Then it's even more. The difficulties are even more striking. Okay. The way I see it is that literary context, in this case, literary context is everything. Shmona Prakim is easy. Why? It's an introduction to a book. It gives theoretical background. It does not require such great fine-tuning to detail, because all practical detail will be given in Maseches Avos. So the Rambam gave a perfectly smooth philosophical introduction to Maseches Avos. We go to Maseches Avos, you enter the world of the rabbis. Here you're in the world of the philosophers. Gemarnim. Okay? So that was easy. In the Mishnah Torah, it's another thing. There's something else that's going on. We're talking about the law. Now, in the law, number one, the law does not create a person so that they will be a person that does the right thing at the right time. The law presupposes we have such a personality, correct? A law-abiding citizen, right? And the law prescribes particular behaviors to that person, presupposing that the person is going to fulfill it correctly. That's what law is, at least roughly speaking, anyway. Right? One law is not a means to another, to the realization of another law. A law is to be fulfilled in and of itself. And the usual understanding of mahu chanun, afato chanun, mahu nikra rachum, afato hayech rachum. Those are specific demands to actually be, that are worthy in and of themselves, like any other legal demand. Okay? You don't pick up a lulav in order to do some other mitzvah. You pick up the lulav with the esrog and the arba minim, and you do it for itself. Okay? So that makes it it makes it almost impossible, therefore, that the whole philosophical apparatus that the Rambam has created here is going to come in smoothly into Hilchos Deos. That's for sure. It makes it almost impossible. And what's striking to me about this, I mean, I think this is, it's just too difficult to pull it off. Turns out in the Hilchos Yisodei Torah, where the Rambam brought Aristotle's theories of physics and metaphysics into the Yahadus, it turns out over there it works smooth as silk. Why? The Rambam lays down a principle that Dibra Torah Kolishon B'nei Adam. Torah speaks in human terms. Therefore, even if God is described there in the Torah and in the Kisrei HaKodesh in human terms, as though he were corporeal, correct? It's not true. Simply, the only levels of description that we have are those in terms of human adjectives. That's all we have. And therefore, that's what's going on there what's going on in Hilchos Yisodei Torah. And what's going on in the Kisrei HaKodesh. So therefore, once that ground is cleared, the Rambam can make his Aristotelian presentation smooth as silk right into the body of the halacha. Okay, so it was daring on two grounds: that he made part of the halacha Yesodei Ha'amuna, the principles of faith. He made it as part of the halacha, and secondly, he was able so smoothly to actually bring the Aristotelian theory into the halacha. And everybody always talks about, when you talk about reason versus revelation, everybody's always looking at that particular part of the Rambam. But I think that the Rambam was successful in setting out the goal of what he wanted to accomplish. He gave a smooth literary description of the Aristotelian worldview within the halacha. When it came to Aristotelian or Arabic Aristotelian ethics, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Because the details of the ethics are the halacha, and in the halacha there is a completely different view of them as being completely distinct from the Aristotelian view. If you confuse means and ends, you're not going to get anywhere. You can't bridge that gap where a behavior in one category is a means in the other category, it's an end in itself. You can't do it. So in terms of bringing the world of reason, the world of philosophy, the world of philosophical approach to ethics into the halakha, I hesitate to say it, but I don't think it's successful, and I don't think it could have been any better than this, and I think it ended up unsuccessful. Couldn't do it because the theory that confuses means and ends has nothing. Okay, so next week we'll start a new topic. This concludes our whole foray into the Rambam's ethics. I really wanted to spend some time to show how, if you reach Mona Prokim by itself, it's beautiful, it's smooth and everything. Once you get over here, life gets a lot complicated, and context drives the discussion. Okay, be well. See you next week.